Thank you. Policymakers have long recognized the intrinsic value of higher education, as we've heard discussed today, and the institutions that provide these services. Colleges and universities perform an essential role in the development of human capital and are often important to new business development in their regions. Since these institutions tend to be geographically distributed across the states in which they reside, they are often the largest or one of the largest employers in the area, and as such they are a critical part of the human capital infrastructure of the region. Colleges and universities also perform another important role that is often not recognized. During periods of economic contraction, they help set the stage for the recovery of the human capital markets. Laid off and or underemployed workers often will use a recession to enroll in college with the intent of acquiring new skills and credentials or strengthening existing ones. The rationale on the part of the worker is that when the economy recovers, the worker will be able to secure a higher paying job, or that the newly acquired skills will help insulate the worker from future layoffs. The purpose of my presentation today is to explore this phenomenon throughout the history of college enrollments and recessions in New York. This is kind of a phenomenon that's largely recognized by college administrators, but often not well recognized or researched, I think, by in the economy and by policymakers. Now, as you can see from Figure 1, there are 270 higher education institutions registered in the state of New York. The distribution of these institutions is very interesting. The public components, SUNY and CUNY, represent a much smaller set of institutions than the private and proprietary institutions, and this is something that's historic in New York. 69% of the higher education sector is proprietary and independent. Now, if you look at the enrollments, the distribution of enrollments amongst these sectors, they're very different. Overall, we have about 1.19 million students enrolled in higher education in New York. Now, in the four-year sector, there are 865,000 students enrolled in that sector. You can see the distribution between the various subcomponents of the sector is quite different than at the two-year, which enrolls about 330,000 students. So you can see here that 53% plus 3% of the proprietary, or a total of 56%, of the four-year sector is in the independent and proprietary, whereas in the two-year sector, it's the public institutions that dominate. They account for 92% of the enrollment at the two-year sector. So these marked differences that we see in the governance of these institutions in higher education reflects basically the history of New York. In the four-year sector, New York has a very strong tradition of independent colleges and universities. In the two-year sector, these institutions aren't found primarily because of the American Community College and the dominance of those institutions, which are all supported. But the support of these institutions is a partnership between the student, the local governance sponsor, and the state. Now, to look at this in terms of the recessions that have occurred in New York, identifying those recessions we've seen today, they are interesting for New York because we really have two distinct economies in the state, the macroeconomies, the downstate and the upstate. And I chose to use a measure today to identify the recessions developed by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It's patterned after the National Coincident Index that's published monthly nationally by the Department of Commerce. And in New York, it includes 4 factors: non-farm payroll employment, real wages and salaries, unemployment, and average weekly hours worked in the manufacturing sector. And what I've done here is I've averaged that coincident index for New York. This index, incidentally, is developed for New Jersey and New York combined, or the states separately, and for New York City alone. So what I've done here for the state of New York is I have averaged that index out annually. So we're looking at we're graphing an annual index here, but it highlights very well the recessions, and I've indexed these to 1976. So the reason I started at 76 is structurally in higher education, that's when basically what we have today began. And so that's a good time period, a long time period to look at those recessions, because we've already seen those 3 recessions that have been identified by earlier researchers and are by the shaded regions, and you can see the steep drops. Now, in my analysis, looking at it on an annual basis, those 3 recessions lasted for different periods of time. The first one really began in February 1980 and lasted until September 1981, about 18 months. The second began in May 1989 and lasted until November 1992, about 40 months. And the last began in January 2001 and lasted until about August 2003, about 30 months. Now the question that I want to ask is, what was happening with higher education enrollments during this period? And first I'm going to focus on the 2-year sector. And again, I'm using the base of 1976. You can see here the green line is SUNY, the blue line is CUNY. You'll notice I didn't include any independent and proprietary institutions on here. The proprietary institutions vary much more dramatically, and the independents do, because they're not represented to the same degree. So there are a lot of factors that can influence enrollments in those sectors. Remember, there's only 8% of this sector that is represented here. So you can see a very strong kind of relationship here in terms of enrollments that occur during these periods of recessions. They're very strong in the 2-year sector. Now, if you look at the 4-year sector, you'll see a much different picture. Enrollments at the 4-sector institutions aren't nearly as sensitive to economic downturns as they were in the 2-year. And you can see from this chart that while they're generally positive, they're not near as strong. And here we've, of course, added in the independent sector institutions because of their dominance in that sector. And you can see in the red line that they were flat here, declined slightly here, but in this period showed pretty strong growth. And actually, this last recession is very different from the former two. So we might ask ourselves the question, why might that be the case? And of course, this is the reason why we see that. This is the graph of high school graduates in New York over the last basically 20-year period. You can see that beginning here in about 1995-96, there's been a general increase in high school graduates. And if you look at the period when this recession occurred, which is right in here, beginning in this period, it's the strongest growth in high school graduates. And so we would, I suggest that that is actually driving a lot of the increase that we're seeing in the 4-year sector in both the independents as well as SUNY and CUNY. Now, there's still an interesting interplay that I would like to show you in the 4-year sector that I think is something for us to think about. This is the 4-year part-time line. You can see indexed again, the way I've indexed them all. You can see that there's been a long gradual decline in the independent sector that goes back to really almost 76. And then there have been declines in the SUNY and CUNY that go back to 89, 90. So there's kind of a long-term trend here that we're dealing with in declines in part-time enrollment. And those continue somewhat more steeply during a recession, but there is a long-term shift. Now, interestingly enough, when we look at the full-time enrollments in these sectors, we see actually there are increases during the recession. So what we might actually be seeing, they're not strong, and they're also impacted by, remember, the increase in high school graduates. What we might be seeing, though, are workers who have been attending part-time, who during a recession then convert to full-time at these institutions, and we see that. Now, in conclusion, as I look at the policy implications of all of this, it makes sense to me that the relationship that I'm exploring here is seen more clearly in two-year institutions than it is in 4. Those institutions are less expensive for students to attend, and for a laid-off worker with a family to support, that would be important. I also think that we can see in that sector that workers use the recession to prepare for the opportunities that are going to be available to them in the recovery. Also, the academic programs in this sector are a shorter duration, and in a recession, you could earn a credential if you were a worker. Also, I think that the educational opportunities in the two-year sector is better aligned with the requirements of the local economy. They plan those academic programs to serve the local needs, and so I think that there is an advantage to the worker. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't observe that the policy for supporting the two-year sector in the public two-year sector is very different than it is in the 4. In New York, these enrollments receive, these institutions receive state support based on an enrollment-driven formula. So state support increases as enrollments go up. So during these periods of recession, these institutions were receiving both tuition revenues and that were increasing, and then state support that probably may not have been increasing. It depends upon the rate of support that the state provides, but probably was not decreasing. So those institutions may not have fared as poorly during the recessions as their sister institutions in the 4-year sector. Now, in the 4-year sector, I think the findings are much more obscure. The institutions are more costly to attend, the programs are longer. Students, unless a student has a particular interest in a 4-year duration program, they may not be using a 4-year sector institution during the recession to the same degree. Also, I think that the policy that we have for supporting these institutions does not work as well as it does in the 2-year sector, which seems to be working very well during the recession. These institutions do not, particularly the public sector institutions, do not receive state support to fund enrollment growth, and I think we see that. And then I also think we see that in the 2-year sector, they are very, very sensitive to responding to the recession. New York has great capacity in its 4-year sector, but it doesn't seem to be using that capacity directly. In the independent sector, those students are gaining their support, their financial aid from a variety of sources that may not be maintained during the recession to the same degree as when we're not in a recession. So I think that we have, when we think of the human capital, we have significant capacity in that sector that's not being utilized. This concludes my presentation.